to creepy corner stories. When the world sleeps, they stay awake. The security guards, the night shift nurses, the lone convenience store clerks, working in the eerie silence while shadows stretch and the wind whispers secrets. But what if the silence isn't empty? What if something else is awake, watching, waiting? Tonight, we dive into the terrifying experiences of those who work the graveyard shift, those who have seen things that can't be explained. Footsteps in an empty hallway, a shadow moving where no one should be, a voice calling from the darkness, but no one is there. Are you ready? Keep the lights on and listen closely, because in the dead of night, you are never truly alone. Let's begin with the horror tonight. Story: the security guard's last rounds. Frank had been a night security guard for over a decade. He had seen his fair share of strange things, shadows moving in empty hallways, flickering lights, even the occasional unexplained noise. But nothing ever truly scared him, until the night he worked alone at the old office building. The place had once been a thriving corporate hub, but now only a few companies rented the lower floors, leaving most of the upper levels abandoned. Frank's job was simple: walk the floors, check the cameras, and make sure no one was trespassing. At 3:12 a.m., he sat in the security office, sipping his coffee, when he noticed something strange on camera 4. The motion sensor had picked up movement on the 7th floor. The 7th floor had been empty for years. Frowning, Frank switched the monitor feed. The grainy footage showed a long, dimly lit hallway. Nothing seemed out of place. Just rows of empty cubicles and a few old office chairs. He sighed and chalked it up to a glitch. Then, one of the chairs moved. It rolled slowly across the floor, as if someone had pushed it. But there was no one there. Frank's stomach tightened. He grabbed his flashlight and walkie-talkie, deciding to check it out himself. Taking the elevator up, he stepped onto the 7th floor. The air was stale, thick with dust. His boots echoed as he walked past the empty desks. Everything was still. Then, the lights flickered. Frank's radio crackled to life. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely above a whisper. He spun around, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then from the far end of the hallway, he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long for a human. Its head twitched unnaturally as if struggling to stay upright. Frank's breath hitched. He stepped backward, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The figure took a step forward. The lights flickered again. When they came back on, the figure was right in front of him. A cold breath brushed against his ear. "You shouldn't be here." Frank bolted. He ran for the elevator, slamming the button repeatedly. The doors opened, and he threw himself inside, jabbing the ground floor button. As the doors slid shut, he saw the figure standing just outside, grinning. The last thing he heard before the doors fully closed was the sound of laughter. Deep, hollow, inhuman. Frank quit the next morning. He never spoke about what he saw. But ever since that night, no security guard has lasted more than a week on the job. Some say, if you walk the 7th floor at 3:12 a.m., you might still hear the laughter. Story: the graveyard shift. Danny had always loved working night shifts at the 24-hour gas station. It was quiet, easy money, and most customers were either truckers or late-night stragglers. Nothing too crazy. That changed on a cold November night. It was 2:30 a.m. when the bells above the glass door chimed. Danny looked up from his magazine. A man had walked in. Something about him felt off. He was tall, gaunt, and wore a tattered black hoodie. His hands were pale, almost bluish, and his nails were long and cracked. But the worst part, his eyes. They were sunken, hollow, and completely black. Danny swallowed hard. Welcome? Need help finding something?" The man didn't respond. He simply walked to the back of the store, his footsteps eerily silent on the tile floor. Danny felt a chill crawl up his spine. He glanced at the security cameras. But something was wrong. The man wasn't showing up on the monitor. Danny blinked. He could see him with his own eyes, right there by the coolers, but on the screen, nothing, just empty aisles. His pulse quickened. Maybe the cameras were glitching. Yeah, that had to be it. Then the lights flickered. When they came back on, the man was standing at the counter. Danny jumped. He hadn't heard him move, hadn't even seen him approach. The man tilted his head, His lips parted slightly, revealing yellow, jagged teeth. Then, in a voice that sounded like a dozen whispers speaking at once, he said, "Do you have—" Danny's throat went dry. Yeah, in the back. We have beef jerky. Not that kind." The man grinned. Danny's stomach dropped. He stepped back, reaching for the bat under the counter. "Look, man, if you're messing with me." The man leaned in closer. His breath was ice cold. "It's almost feeding time." Suddenly, the glass door swung open. A trucker walked in, yawning and rubbing his eyes. The second the stranger saw him, his face twisted into something inhuman. Then, he vanished. 1 second, he was there. The next, he was gone. The trucker looked around. "Hey man, you okay? You look like you saw a ghost." Danny could barely breathe. His hands were shaking. He checked the cameras again. The timestamp still read 2:30 a.m. It hadn't moved. The footage was frozen. That was the last night Danny ever worked at that gas station. And to this day, every worker who takes the night shift says the same thing. At 2:30 a.m. sharp, the door chimes. And if you look toward the back of the store, you might see someone watching, waiting. Story: The Elevator That Never Stops. Mark had only been working as a hotel night manager for a few weeks when he started hearing the stories. The 13th floor, the janitor had warned him. Don't ever stop on the 13th floor after midnight. Mark had laughed it off at first. The hotel didn't even have a 13th floor. It skipped from 12 to 14 like most old buildings. But one night, just past 2 a.m., he learned the truth. It started with a call from room 1408. "Front desk, how can I assist you?" he asked. At first, there was only static. Then, a whisper. "Help, me." A chill crawled up Mark's spine. "Hello, who is this?" "They won't let me leave." Click. The line went dead. Mark frowned. The problem? Room 1408 wasn't occupied. It hadn't been booked in months. Swallowing his nerves, he grabbed his master key and took the elevator up to the 14th floor. The hallway was eerily silent, the old wallpaper peeling under the dim lights. As he approached room 1408, he hesitated. The door was slightly ajar. A cold gust of air blew out. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was untouched, the curtains drawn. Nothing seemed out of place, until he noticed the bathroom door. It was open just a crack. A shadow moved inside. Mark's breath hitched. He reached out, then the bathroom door slammed shut. The lights flickered. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of something rotten. And then, from inside the bathroom, knock, knock, knock. Mark backed away, his pulse hammering. The elevator. He needed to get out. He sprinted back to the hallway and jammed the button. The doors slid open, and he dove inside, frantically pressing the lobby button. The doors closed. The elevator hummed as it began to descend. Then it stopped. The display above the door flickered. 13. Mark's stomach dropped. The elevator shouldn't have stopped. There was no 13th floor. Then, the lights went out. In the darkness, he heard breathing. Shallow, raspy, right behind him. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. A cold hand brushed against his shoulder. And then in the pitch black, a whisper slithered into his ear. "You should have listened." The doors suddenly opened and Mark stumbled out onto the wrong floor. The hallway stretched endlessly, the carpet stained, the walls covered in claw marks. The doors were all open, and inside each room, dark figures stood, staring at him. He ran back to the elevator, but the doors had already closed. The button wouldn't work. Then the whispers began. Dozens of voices, laughing, calling his name. The last thing Mark saw before everything went black was the number above the elevator changing. 14. Back to 13. The next morning, the janitor found the elevator stalled between floors. Mark was inside, curled in the corner, his hair completely white. He never spoke again. And now, every night at 2 a.m., the elevator stops, just for a moment on the 13th floor. If you're ever alone in that hotel and the doors open unexpectedly. Story: The Watcher in the Warehouse. Ben had worked the night shift at the shipping warehouse for almost a year. It was an easy job: clock in at 10 p.m., monitor the security cameras, and do a round every hour. Nothing ever happened. Until one night, something did. It started with a simple motion alert. Ben was in the break room, scrolling through his phone when the monitor beeped. He sighed and checked the cameras. Aisle 4. A tall shelf stacked with boxes, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. Nothing seemed out of place. Then on the screen, a box slid off the shelf. Ben frowned. There was no one there. No wind, no movement. Just the box, lying in the middle of the floor. Probably just stacked wrong, he thought. Still, he had to check it out. Grabbing his flashlight, he made his way through the dark warehouse. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the scent of old cardboard. His footsteps echoed between the towering metal shelves. He reached aisle 4. The box was there, just like on the camera. It had fallen from the third shelf, its contents spilled onto the concrete. Old office supplies, papers, and a few scattered pens. Ben knelt to pick them up. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the next aisle over. He froze. "Hey," he called out. "Who's there?" Silence. Ben swallowed hard and stepped toward the end of the aisle. He peered around the corner. Nothing. Just row after row of empty shelves. Then, a shadow moved. Not just any shadow. A tall, thin figure standing at the far end of the aisle. Ben's breath hitched. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching. His flashlight flickered. When it came back on, the figure was closer. Ben staggered backward. "Screw this," he muttered, turning to run, and came face to face with it. The figure loomed over him. Its face was wrong, stretched, hollow, eyes sunken deep into black pits. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Then it whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." The lights in the warehouse flickered wildly. The temperature dropped. The shelves trembled, and then everything went black. Ben woke up in the break room, his head pounding. The cameras showed nothing. No shadow, no figure, not even the box that had fallen. But on the wall behind him, scratched deep into the metal, were 3 words, "I see you." Story: the hospital's last call. Michael had been a night shift nurse for almost 7 years. He was used to the eerie silence of the hospital, the dimly lit corridors, and the occasional strange noises that always had a logical explanation. But one night, he got a call that changed everything. It was just past 3 a.m. when the old landline at the nurse's station rang. Strange. No one ever used that phone anymore. Michael hesitated before answering. Hello. For a moment, all he heard was static. Then a weak, trembling voice whispered, "Nurse, please help me." A chill ran down his spine. The voice sounded frail, desperate. "Who is this? What room are you in?" Silence. Then a faint cough. Room 502 flashed in his mind. Michael's stomach twisted. Room 502 had been sealed off for years after a patient had died under mysterious circumstances. No one went in. No one came out. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the old wing of the hospital, his footsteps echoing down the deserted hallway. When he reached room 502, the door was open. That wasn't possible. The door had been locked for as long as he could remember. He shined his flashlight inside. The room was dark, the hospital bed still neatly made, covered in dust. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something rotting. Then his radio crackled. Michael. His breath caught in his throat. That wasn't the voice of anyone on duty. It was the same weak, trembling voice from the phone. His flashlight flickered, and the hospital bed was no longer empty. A frail, emaciated woman lay there, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her sunken eyes locked onto his. Then her lips curled into a slow, sickening smile. "You finally came." Michael staggered back, his body frozen with terror. The woman sat up. The heart monitor beside her suddenly beeped to life, flatlining. The lights flickered wildly. The door slammed shut, and then she screamed. A blood-curdling wail that shook the entire floor. The windows shattered, the walls trembled. Michael blacked out. When he woke up, he was lying on the floor outside room 502. The door was locked again, just as it had been before. No one believed him. The hospital records showed no calls had been made that night. And room 502? It had been empty for over 20 years. But to this day, nurses say that if you're alone on the night shift, sometimes the old landline will ring. And if you answer, a weak voice will whisper, "Please, help me." And if you go to room 502, you might not come back. Story: the Phantom Passenger. Jared had been driving taxis for years, and the night shift always had its fair share of weirdness. Drunk passengers, lost tourists, and the occasional fare who disappeared before paying. But nothing compared to what happened one rainy night on the outskirts of town. It was past 2 a.m. when he got a ride request from an old road near the abandoned train station. The location was strange. There were no houses or businesses nearby, but a fair was a fair. As he pulled up, his headlights cut through the thick fog rolling in from the tracks. A woman stood there, dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, her dark hair soaked from the rain. She didn't have an umbrella, didn't even seem to notice the cold. Jared lowered the window slightly. "Need a ride?" She nodded silently and got in the back seat. "Where to?" he asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Home." He nodded and started driving. The air inside the cab felt strangely cold, despite the heater running. He checked the mirror again. The woman was gone. His stomach clenched. He slammed the brakes and turned around. The back seat was empty. His pulse hammered in his ears. He was about to throw the car into reverse when... a whisper. "Keep driving." Jared froze. The voice came from the back seat, but there was no one there. Then, slowly, the mirror fogged up, as if someone was breathing against it. And in the mist, a message appeared, written by an unseen hand. "Almost home." Jared's breath hitched. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He wanted to stop. He wanted to get out. But he couldn't. The car kept moving, the streetlights flickering as he passed them. His radio crackled with static. The GPS flickered wildly, the screen glitching between numbers and symbols. Then up ahead, he saw something, a cemetery. The iron gates stood open, and beyond them, the crumbling tombstones stretched into the fog. His heart pounded. The car was driving itself. Jared slammed his foot on the brakes, skidding to a stop just outside the cemetery entrance. The radio cut out, the headlights flickered, and then a soft voice from the back seat. "Thank you for the ride." The door unlocked, the air shifted, and in the mirror, he saw her. For just a moment, she sat there, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her lips curling into a sad, knowing smile. Then, she vanished. The door creaked open on its own. The rain poured harder. Jared didn't stick around. He floored it, speeding away without looking back. The next day, he checked the ride logs. No record of a pickup, no record of a passenger. But when he looked in his rearview mirror, a single wet handprint remained on the backseat window. Some cab drivers still say that on stormy nights, if you drive past the old train station, you might see a woman waiting. And if you pick her up, make sure you don't take her all the way home. Story: The Man in the Hotel Hallway. Ryan had worked as a night receptionist at the Blackwood Hotel for nearly a year. It was an old place, built in the early 1900s, and had its fair share of ghost stories. But Ryan didn't believe in that stuff. At least, not until the night of room 709. It was 2:43 a.m. when the phone rang at the front desk. "Blackwood Hotel, how can I help you?" A man's voice, deep and flat, spoke on the other end. "There's someone standing outside my room." Ryan frowned and checked the system. The call was coming from room 709. That was impossible. Room 709 had been vacant for months. His hands tightened around the phone. "Sir, are you saying someone is outside your door right now?" A pause. Then, "No, he's inside." The line went dead. A chill crept up Ryan's spine. He stared at the monitor, at the empty check-in list. No one should be in that room. He grabbed his master key and hesitantly made his way to the 7th floor. The hallway was silent, the dim wall sconces flickering slightly. When he reached room 709, he hesitated. The door was slightly open. A slow, uneasy breath left his lips as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something stale. The bed was perfectly made, no luggage, no signs of anyone staying there. But the closet door was open, and inside, a man stood facing the wall, tall, motionless, his back to Ryan. Ryan's throat went dry. "Sir?" The man didn't move. Ryan took a shaky step forward. "Sir, are you?" The lights flickered, and suddenly the man was closer, not turning, not moving, just closer. Ryan's breath hitched. He hadn't seen him move. Another flicker, closer. Ryan staggered back toward the door. His heart hammered. The lights went out completely. In the pitch black, he heard breathing, right in front of him. Then, a whisper, inches from his face. "You shouldn't be here." The lights came back on. The room was empty. Ryan bolted. He ran back to the front desk, his pulse pounding in his ears. Checking the cameras, his hands shook. Room 709's door was still closed. But as he stared at the screen, a dark figure stepped into the hallway, tall, motionless, facing the camera. Then, the screen went black. Ryan quit the next morning. The hotel never rented out room 709 again. But sometimes, guests still complain that at 2:43 a.m. their phones ring and a voice whispers, "He's inside." Story: The Last Patient. Dr. James Carter had worked the night shift in the hospital's psychiatric ward for nearly a decade. He had seen patients with terrifying delusions, heard them scream about things in the dark, but he always believed it was just their illness. Until one night, he didn't. It was just past 3 a.m. when the nurse's station received a call. The voice on the other end was weak, barely above a whisper. "Doctor, he's coming." James frowned. "Who is this?" The static on the line crackled. Then, room 316. James checked the log. Room 316 had been empty for months. A chill crept down his spine, but he forced himself to investigate. The psychiatric ward was silent, except for the occasional distant murmur of a sleeping patient. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as he made his way down the corridor. When he reached room 316, the door was slightly open. Inside, the bed was occupied. A man sat there, head bowed, hands folded in his lap. He was wearing a hospital gown, but his skin was deathly pale, and his hair was thin and gray. James didn't recognize him. "Sir," James called out. The man didn't move. James stepped closer. His breath caught in his throat when he noticed the patient's wristband. It had a name on it. James Carter. His own name. James' vision blurred. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The man slowly lifted his head. His face was identical to James. But his eyes, they were black. Endless. A slow, sick smile stretched across his lips. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered. The air grew freezing. The walls trembled. And then James felt hands grab his shoulders. Cold hands. Many hands. A scream echoed in the room, his own. And then, darkness. James woke up in a hospital bed. The lights were dim, the machines around him beeping softly. His head ached. A nurse walked in, looking startled. "Dr. Carter?" she gasped. You're awake?" James tried to sit up. "What do you mean?" The nurse swallowed hard. "You were found unconscious in room 316 6 months ago. You've been in a coma ever since." James' blood ran cold. His mind raced. That wasn't possible. He had been working the night shift just last night, hadn't he? And then, from the hallway outside his room, a whisper. "He's coming." And that was tonight's terrifying tale. But tell me, do you believe it was just a story? Or could there be something lurking in the dark, waiting? Maybe it's already watching you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling tale from Creepy Corner Stories. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.